Zero RB, it's the buzzword going around fantasy football over the last couple of years. It's this idea to fade running backs. Wide receivers are safer and more reliable in fantasy football, but is that true? We're talking about that in today's video. As always, give us a like and subscribe. Appreciate your support. We put out content all year long, so click that like, click that subscribe, click that bell. Zero RB, there's no set rule or set number of rounds you have to go before taking a running back to be considered the zero RB strategy. Most people, I would say at least the first 5 rounds, no running backs. I do hear a lot of people say it's actually the first 6 rounds. Maybe it's 7. I don't know. We haven't come to a consensus here. I'm just going to say it's the first 6 rounds. It's the first 6 rounds, not drafting a running back. That's the zero RB strategy. We're seeing it more and more in fantasy football, and we're seeing the effects of it. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of numbers at you guys here. Hopefully you can follow along. I think this is interesting stuff. Is zero RB really the right strategy? Are wide receivers really more reliable and dependable than running backs? Let's find out together. First, I want to just look at the effect of zero RB. This is 2019 ADP according to Fantasy Pros, PPR, by the way. There were 4 running backs going in the top 5 picks in 2019, 7 in the first round. So over half the first round was running backs. By the end of the round 2, beginning of round 3, so at that 2-3 turn, we had 12 running backs gone. By the middle of round 3, we had 15 running backs gone. And by the 4-5 turn, we had 24 running backs taken. You look at and fast forward to today's NFL, we have 3 running backs going in the top 5. Now, I do suspect if Jamar Chase wasn't holding out and Justin Jefferson had a better quarterback that, perceptive wise, that there would actually only be 1 running back taken in the top 5 and McCaffrey. Technically, there's 3. Bijan and Brees sneak in there. So not a big difference here. 5 in the first round, so 2 less, which is pretty significant. By the middle of round 3, the top 12 running backs lasting to the middle of round 3. Top 15 running backs are lasting to the early round 4. And top 24 running backs are lasting to the end of round 6, guys. So we're talking about a pretty significant, we're talking about a 2-round difference in terms of the top 24 running backs. You really see the difference in the running back ADPs over the last 5 years and the effect that zero RB is having. So what I did is I went back and looked at the last 5 years and compared running backs and wide receivers in terms of their total points finished per season and their points per game, and trying to figure out, are they really more reliable? And I think the information here is actually pretty telling. So first, we're looking at top 5 at each position, the top 5 ADP running backs, the top 5 ADP wide receivers. And what we see here is there's actually the top 5 wide receivers are a little bit more, actually a little bit more. They're more than just a little bit more reliable. They're decently more reliable than the top 5 running backs. 32% of the top 5 running backs taken finished top 5, compared to 48% for wide receivers, right? But what's interesting is that 32% more are at least finishing in the top 12, whereas only 16% more are finishing in the top 12. So you add those 2 numbers together, they're both 64% for both the running backs and wide receivers. 64% of running backs taken in the top 5 are finishing top 12. 64% of the wide receivers taken in the top 5 are also finishing top 12. It's just a little bit more consistent in terms of the top 5 finishers. You see the other numbers here. I also looked at top 15, top 24, and then outside the top 24. If you're taking a running back in the top 5 and they're finishing in the outside the top 24, this is in total points, by the way, that's a complete bust, an absolute complete bust. Now, if you take a running back top 5 and he finishes RB20, yeah, you're disappointed, but at least you'll still be able to start him. Outside top 24 is like you're barely even being able to start the guy. Again, this is for total points. So we do see a little bit higher of a bust rate for the top 5 running backs in ADP compared to the wide receivers, 24% for wide receivers, 28% for running backs. So wide receivers kind of win that round, right? However, this is points per game, by the way. The next one, top 5 running backs still top 5 running backs, but this is points per game. What this is showing basically is that running backs at the top at least are getting hurt a little bit more, which we all kind of know that running backs do have a higher risk injury. But in terms of points per game, it's a much more forgiving stat. Wide receivers are still winning. 12, as you can see here, 44% of the running backs in the top 5 are at top 5 points per game. 52% for wide receivers, and only 12% are busting for wide receivers compared to 16% for top 24. Now, when we start to look at the other running backs taken outside the top 5, that's where we start to see the separation that actually running backs are more reliable to a certain extent. Here we go. These are the other top 12 running backs and wide receivers. So these are running back and wide receivers drafted 6 through 12 according to ADP. 26% of them are finishing in the top 5 compared to only 11% for wide receivers. Now, that makes sense because there are more receivers in the top 5 finishing top 5. So that means there's less space for these other wide receivers to finish top 25. However, if you look down the list here, you have 57% combined of the top 12 running backs, 6 through 12, are finishing top 12, compared to only 40% of the wide receivers finishing top 12. That's a little bit alarming, right? Add another 14% here. Yeah, add another 14%. So we're talking about, what is that, about 71, 72% of running backs 6 through 12, according to ADP, are finishing in the top 15, compared to only 43% of wide receivers taken 6 through 12 finishing top 15. 43% of the wide receivers that are drafted ADP 6 through 12 are not busting, but they're finishing outside the top 24, which to me is almost a bust, right? Is almost a little bit less. If you're taking wide receiver 12 and he finishes wide receiver 25, it's not quite a bust, but still, that's a pretty high number compared to only 14% of the running backs that are drafted 6 through 12 finishing outside the top 24. That's a huge difference, a huge, huge difference. And also in points per game, it's very similar stuff here. A 14%, the number drops slightly, I believe. Oh, no, it's about the same, 14 and 34%. It drops slightly compared to 26 and 31%. For wide receivers, it's roughly the same, a little bit less, actually, 9%, 23%. Outside the top 24, 31% to 11%. All right, and that's in points per game. So running backs are more consistent in both total points and in points per game outside of the top 5 guys. Now I went on to look at just a little bit more here. I looked at the next 3 running backs taken to round out to top 15. So running backs 13 to 15 and wide receivers drafted 13 to 15. We had a lot bigger number here for the running backs busting. 60% of the running backs that are drafted ADP 13 to 15 at their position are busting compared to only 27% for the wide receivers. And points per game, it's about the same. It's 40% to 40%. So what does all this mean, basically? Just to simplify it a little bit more here. 17 of 25 top 5 finishers over the last 5 years were top 12 picks for running backs, 68%. 36 of the 60 top 12 finishers were top 12 picks, 60%. And then 54 of the 120 top 24 guys over the last 5 years, about 45% of them were top 24 picks. Across the board here, the running backs are finishing a little bit better than the wide receivers. The only area where wide receivers are finishing better than running backs is the top 5 ADP wide receivers compared to the top 5 ADP running backs. Outside of that, running backs are a little bit safer in terms of their production compared to the wide receivers and where they finish. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, what about injuries? And I did look at the injuries here. I looked at injuries, and what I found here was it's not as big of a separation as you would think. Running backs, these running backs that I'm talking over the last 5 years, so the top 15 running backs according to ADP each of the last 5 years, so that's 75 running backs, on average missed 3 games, 3.01 games, 3 games per player. 15 of 75 missed 5 or more. 5 or more to me is you're missing a third of your fantasy regular season. That's significant, right? Or playoffs. That's significant. Once you start to hit, 5 or more missed games, that's where it starts to kill you. 15 of 75 running backs, 20% of them missed 5 or more games. Compared to wide receivers. Now, wide receivers are missing less games on average, 2.35, right? 2.35 games. That's pretty significant. That's like 0.6, 0.7 games per player less missed. But what's interesting here is 14 of 74. It's 74 because I took out Antonio Brown 2019 when, hit that whole situation when he went to the Raiders and all that. I took that game out just because you can't predict that type of stuff. 14 of 74 wide receivers missed 5 or more games, 19%. Essentially the same. The same percentage of running backs and wide receivers are missing 5 or more games. I found that a little bit surprising. I would have expected this to be like 25, 30%, and this be like 15 to 20 at the most. But I would expect the running backs to be higher. That's not the case. It's basically the same. The same amount of running backs missing 5 games or more, and the same amount of wide receivers missing 5 games or more percentage-wise. Now, the last thing I looked at, and this is the last thing I promised, because I know a lot of people are going to think about this too. Well, it's not just are the running backs finishing in their position top 15 are wide compared to wide receivers. It's about points. Who's scoring more points? Is wide receiver 15 scoring more points than wide receiver or than running back 15? Well, I looked at that too. So I looked at the average points for top 5 running backs, 20 points. Compared to wide receivers, 20.3. So about the same. The median, which again, median is it takes a little bit, it takes the outliers out of the equation a little bit. 19.3 for running backs, 19.7 for wide receivers. Average point for running backs and points per game, 21.3 compared to 20.8. And the median 20.9 to 20.5. So points per game, running backs win out a little bit. But, if my running back misses 15 games, I don't care. Total points is not that far off. It does favor the top 5 wide receivers, which makes sense because we talked about top 5 wide receivers are a little bit more reliable in terms of finishing in the top 5. Now we look at the average points for top 12 running backs, 16 compared to 16.4, median at 15.6, 16.4, and then points per game, 16.7 to 17. Still very close. Wide receivers, this isn't PPR, by the way. Wide receivers are right there, right? They're right there. They're slightly ahead of them. And then for running backs as well, 13 through 15 is 14.1 to 15.3. So you see here that the wide receivers are scoring more points compared to the guys being drafted at their same positional ADP, right? So our wide receivers, is the strategy to go 0 RB? I never like to tell you this is the strategy that you should approach. You should kind of see how your draft is going, right? And you should zig when everyone's zagging. It used to be that 0 RB was you're zigging when everyone's zagging. But now we're getting to the point where if you have 4 or 5 people trying to go 0 RB in a draft, it's not going to work out. You're going to be overdrafting wide receivers. And this data is showing you that, our wide receivers points-wise scoring a little bit more? They are. Are they more reliable in terms of where they finish in their positional ranks? Not quite. The running backs are slightly more reliable, but wide receivers, wide receiver 15 on average is scoring more than running back 15. So you can those two kind of balance each other out a little bit. But I don't think it's to the point where we should just be completely fading running back just to fade running back. If your draft falls that way, I'm fine with you going 0 RB. However, don't force it is my advice. Is don't try to force a strategy of 0 RB, especially when 2 or 3 or 4 other guys on your league are trying to go 0 RB, because then you're going to be taking wide receivers that over running backs that should not be taken. So one last thing I'll say is I still truly believe that a dominant running back is the most valuable position in fantasy. I know maybe that's a little old school. I've been playing fantasy since 2005. And, back in 2005, it was a running back world, right? I still believe, even in 2024, that a dominant running back is the most valuable position you can have on your team. Because one, there are less running backs these days that are consistently giving you good production. So if you get one of those guys, you already have a hand up on everyone else. Another thing is running backs, the top tier guys, the guys at the top, they can score points unlike wide receivers. Since 2019, there have been 6 running backs to average 24 or more points in PPR per game. six running backs to average 24 points or more in PPR per game. There's only been one wide receiver to do that. That was Cooper Kupp. It was Cooper Kupp in his major season. You literally need maybe the greatest wide receiver season we've ever seen in order to crack 24 points per game. Whereas there's been six, literally more than one running back, slightly more than one running back per year can average more than 24 points per game. And by the way, of those six, three of them were over 20 of running backs. Three of them were over 25 points per game. We've never, at least in the last 5 years, we have not seen a wide receiver finish with 25 points per game or more. Maybe one, actually. Maybe it was Cooper Kupp that year. I'm trying to remember now. I guess I'll tell you, yeah, Cooper Kupp is the only wide receiver to average over 24 points per game in the last 5 years. So again, literally, maybe, arguably, the greatest wide receiver season of all time. You compare that to some of the dominant performances we've seen from Christian McCaffrey, who averaged 29.5 points per game in 2019. Christian McCaffrey, who averaged 30 points per game in 2020. Now, he didn't play that much. Alvin Kamara had over 25 points in 2020. Dalvin Cook had over 24 points in 2020. It's just so much easier for the running backs to get there. So there's something to that as well. And one last thing. I know I said last thing last time, and this is the last thing. Bad offenses affect wide receivers more than they do running backs. Now, ideally, you want running backs and wide receivers on good offenses because that's, the path to fantasy success. But it's much more likely for a running back to produce on a bad offense than it is for a wide receiver. And so that means there's a little bit less other factors that affect the wide receivers, in my opinion. There's a little bit less other factors. We just need volume for running backs, right? So if you have this team where, we think we know who's going to be the best offensive teams in the NFL, but there are times when we're wrong. So you take that out of the equation, you add all that stuff together, and I don't see why we should completely fade running backs the first 5 or 6 picks unless your draft board dictates it. That's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully you appreciate it. Hopefully you'll be doing your draft coming up here in it's Monday, August 26th. Hopefully you're doing your draft this weekend and you take this information and it helps you a little bit. So appreciate you all. Like and subscribe. Get us to over 550 here soon. Appreciate you all. Catch you all.